Los Angeles Fire Department report. Veteran firefighter confronted by personal betrayal amid blaze. In the early hours of this morning, a large fire broke out in the heart of downtown Los Angeles. A blaze that quickly spread across several city blocks, leaving chaos in its wake. Firefighters responded immediately, with dozens of fire trucks and rescue teams working tirelessly to control the inferno. Among them was Jackson Reed, a seasoned firefighter with more than 4 decades of service to the Los Angeles Fire Department. Reed, now 70 years old, had witnessed countless fires in his time, but this one was different. As soon as the alarm sounded, he sprang into action, grabbing his gear and rushing to the scene. Despite his age, Reed was known for his unwavering dedication to the job, never once allowing his age to slow him down. The fire had already engulfed several buildings, and Reed, along with his team, was at the front lines, saving lives and trying to contain the blaze before it spread further into the city. What Reed didn't expect, however, was the personal conflict that would confront him amidst the flames. Leah Morgan, a former police officer turned private investigator, arrived at the scene shortly after the fire broke out. She had been called in to investigate the possibility of arson. Morgan had a complicated history with Reed. The two had once been in a long-term relationship, one that ended under painful circumstances. Years ago, Reed had discovered that Morgan had been unfaithful to him, carrying on an affair with one of his colleagues at the fire department. The betrayal had broken Reed's heart, and despite their separation, the pain lingered. Now Morgan was back in Los Angeles, working as a private investigator. Her sudden return to the city and her presence at the fire scene were both unexpected and deeply unwelcome to Reed. As Morgan stood on the sidelines, observing the fire and taking notes for her investigation, Reed couldn't help but notice her. The sight of her brought back memories of betrayal, of the late-night arguments, of the trust that had been shattered between them. Despite their past, Reed did his best to maintain his composure. He couldn't afford to let personal emotions interfere with his duty. The fire was spreading fast, and there was no time for anything but action. Reed and his team worked tirelessly, battling the flames and coordinating rescue efforts. He could feel Morgan's eyes on him, but he ignored it, focusing solely on the task at hand. As the hours passed, the fire continued to rage. The smoke billowed high into the sky, and the streets were filled with fire trucks, ambulances, and police officers. The atmosphere was chaotic, but Reed remained calm. He was used to this after all. He had seen fires like this before. The destruction, the fear, the adrenaline. But this time it felt different. It felt personal. Morgan, on the other hand, couldn't keep her distance. She knew she had hurt Reed, and she hated herself for it. The affair with his colleague had been a mistake, a terrible mistake, and it had cost her the most important relationship she had ever had. She had tried to move on, to rebuild her life, but seeing Reed again brought all the unresolved emotions rushing back. She knew she owed him an apology, but it seemed impossible. What could she say? How could she undo the damage she had caused? As the fire continued, Reed and Morgan exchanged only brief, tense glances. Neither of them spoke to the other, but the air between them was thick with unspoken words. Reed could feel the weight of the past bearing down on him, but he pushed it aside, focusing on his job. He wasn't there to deal with personal matters. He was there to save lives, to stop the fire from claiming even more victims. Meanwhile, the investigation into the cause of the fire continued. Morgan, despite her personal feelings, did her job with professionalism. She took photos, collected evidence, and spoke to witnesses. But there was something else on her mind, something that had been nagging at her for years. She had never truly forgiven herself for what she had done to Reed. Every time she looked at him, she saw the pain she had caused, the trust she had broken. As the fire was slowly brought under control, Reed allowed himself a brief moment to breathe. His team had worked hard, and the worst of the fire was over. The flames were dying down, and the buildings were no longer in immediate danger. But as Reed stood there, watching the fire finally subside, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He had always been a man of action, focused on the task at hand. But today, the fire seemed secondary. His emotions were in turmoil, and it felt as though the past had come rushing back with a vengeance. Morgan, too, was feeling conflicted. She had never expected to encounter Reed again, certainly not under these circumstances. The last time they had spoken, they had parted ways with harsh words, and since then, neither had tried to reconcile. But now, standing there in the shadow of the fire, she realized just how much she had lost. Reed had always been there for her, always supportive, and she had thrown that away. And yet, despite everything, he was still out there, doing the same dangerous work he had always done. After the fire was under control, Reed returned to the firehouse to debrief with his colleagues. The fire was contained, and there were no reported fatalities, but the emotional toll on Reed was significant. His interaction with Morgan had reminded him of the deep scars from their past, and it was clear that he had not yet healed from the pain of her betrayal. As for Morgan, she left the scene quietly, her heart heavy with regret. She had come to do her job, but she had left with more than just the evidence she had collected. She had left with the realization that the past could never truly be erased, no matter how hard she tried. In the days that followed, the investigation into the fire continued. Morgan's suspicions about arson were eventually proven true, but the case went cold, with no suspects being apprehended. As for Reed, he continued his work with the fire department, but the emotional scars from his past lingered. He had put his personal life on hold for too long, and though he had survived the fire, he knew that the real battle was within himself. The blaze was over, but for Reed and Morgan, the fire within them would never truly be extinguished. This version adds more detail to the emotional and investigative aspects, allowing the story to build slowly over a longer period while maintaining the focus on the fire, the characters' inner turmoil, and their professional lives. Months passed, and Jackson's life continued. Despite the emotional turmoil, his commitment to his work, his duty to serve, and his undying resilience were all he had left. Yet he still couldn't completely escape the heartbreak. He was raising someone else's son, the child of his wife's infidelity, and though he loved the boy deeply, there was always a part of him that longed for peace and a sense of true belonging. But life, as always, had its twists. Jackson knew the storm was far from over. His ex-wife, Leah, continued to drift in and out of his life, sending cryptic messages and showing up uninvited. Despite her betrayal, there was a part of Jackson that still missed her, a part of him that hadn't been able to fully let go. And then there was the truth Jackson had long suspected, but could no longer ignore. Leah's affair wasn't just a one-time slip. It had been ongoing, and now it was becoming even more complicated. One evening, Jackson came home late, exhausted from his shift. As he stepped into his apartment, he saw a text from Leah, another one of her cryptic, emotional messages. But this time, it was different. She wasn't alone. In the message, she confided that her affair with Eli hadn't been as simple as it seemed. There had been promises of a future, of a life they would build together once the dust settled, and now it was too late to turn back. Eli, the man Jackson had tried to forgive, was still a constant presence in Leah's life. Jackson had always suspected something deeper between them, but now it was undeniable. The heartbreak of knowing the truth began to eat away at him. The man he had once considered a friend had stolen not just his wife, but his trust and dignity. Yet Jackson kept his composure. He wouldn't let the past define him, but the wound was deep. Then an unexpected event threw Jackson further into the chaos. Leah, now fully involved with Eli, turned up at Jackson's apartment one night, seeking refuge after a violent argument with Eli. He had left her, telling her their relationship had run its course. Leah was devastated. She came to Jackson for comfort, hoping he would take her back, but Jackson knew better. This wasn't love, it was desperation. As they spoke, Jackson couldn't help but notice how Leah's demeanor had changed. She was no longer the woman he once loved. He saw the cracks in her facade, the guilt and pain that weighed on her. But it didn't matter. Too much had happened. There was no going back. Jackson was no longer interested in reconciliation. He had moved on in his own way. He knew what he needed now. It wasn't her. It wasn't even the life they could have had. It was something deeper, a sense of closure, of moving forward with dignity and strength. But before the story could fully settle, Leah made one last attempt to lure him back. She revealed something that completely shattered his already broken heart. She was pregnant with Eli's child. At that moment, Jackson realized something about himself. He was stronger than he had ever believed. Despite the pain, despite the betrayal, he was not going to let this break him. He would raise Eli's child, not because he had to, but because it was the right thing to do. Jackson could be the father the boy needed, even though the child wasn't his own. And just when Jackson thought he had seen it all, the story took another twist. His world would never be the same. The web of lies, deceit, and betrayal was now an inextricable part of his life. Yet Jackson stood tall, knowing that he would not let this define him. His journey wasn't over yet. This is the second part of the story. Let me know if you need further adjustments. As Jackson tried to come to terms with the mess his life had become, the situation seemed to take on a life of its own. He had accepted that he would raise Eli's child, the one Leah had carried in her womb, despite the betrayal. But the challenges were far from over. Time passed, and Jackson found himself raising the child with the same love and dedication he had given to his own flesh and blood. The boy, whom they named Noah, grew up under Jackson's watchful eyes. Despite the tumultuous beginning, the bond between them deepened. Jackson had grown to love Noah as his own son. The child seemed to embody the strength and resilience Jackson had fought so hard to maintain. However, the reality of the situation was never far from Jackson's mind. Leah's presence, though occasional, still stirred old wounds. Eli had left her, but Leah refused to let go of the past. She would return from time to time, hoping to reignite something with Jackson, but he had already made peace with who she had become and what she had done. He had a new purpose now. His focus was on Noah, and that was enough. Despite this, there was an ongoing tension. One Jackson couldn't escape. It was a battle between the old and the new, between what was and what could have been. And then, out of nowhere, came the twist that would change everything once again. Leah revealed that she was pregnant again. This time, it wasn't with Eli, but with someone else. The man was a stranger to Jackson, someone Leah had met in her attempts to rebuild her life. She wanted Jackson to be involved, to help her raise the child, something he couldn't ignore. Jackson was left torn. He had spent so much of his life looking after others, trying to fix everything around him. Now it seemed the past wasn't done with him. The choices he had made, the promises he had kept, were all coming back to haunt him. But Jackson wasn't one to back down. He stood his ground and decided to confront the situation head-on. He agreed to help Leah, but on his terms. He wasn't going to be dragged back into her web of lies, but he would ensure that the child was raised properly, without the drama and dysfunction that had clouded his past. As months went by, Jackson began to see more clearly the path ahead. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future. He focused on his work, on his family, and on Noah. The boy was growing into a fine young man, and Jackson had come to realize that his strength had never been in the battles he fought with others, but in the quiet, steadfast love he gave to those who mattered most. And then, just when Jackson thought he had finally found peace, Leah's final act of betrayal struck. She came to him one last time, desperate and frantic. She had been hiding a secret from him. Eli had returned into her life, and they had rekindled their relationship. Leah, unable to make a decision, had left Jackson once again, choosing to live a life with Eli, the man who had torn their family apart. Jackson didn't react in anger. Instead, he felt a strange sense of closure. This was the end of that chapter. He had done everything he could. He had loved, he had been a father, and he had stayed true to his principles. It was time to let go, to embrace the new life he had built for himself and Noah. And so Jackson continued his journey, now fully understanding that life, with all its twists and turns, was not about the mistakes you made, but about the courage to move forward. He wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain. He would keep fighting for his son, for his own redemption, and for a peace that had eluded him for so long. Years went by, and Jackson, now in his late 70s, found a kind of peace that had eluded him for so long. The world around him had changed, but he remained resolute, focused on the future and the family he had built, albeit not the family he had imagined when he was younger. Life had thrown its challenges at him, but he had weathered them all with the same unwavering strength that had defined him throughout his career as a firefighter. Jackson's relationship with Noah, his son, had grown stronger over the years. Noah had become the son Jackson had always wanted, even though his biological origins were a painful reminder of the betrayal Jackson had suffered. Noah, for all his life, had only known Jackson as his father, and that bond was unbreakable. Jackson had raised him with love, discipline, and care, never once showing him the shadows of his past. Despite the years of betrayal, Jackson had found a kind of redemption in raising Noah. He had always believed that his purpose was to protect and serve, and now he understood that his true service was to his son. But as the years passed, something began to change in Jackson. The fire that had once driven him, the passion that had fueled his days, started to fade. He was no longer the young firefighter rushing into burning buildings. His body was beginning to show signs of age, and his once strong frame was now slowing down. One day, while taking a walk in the park, Jackson met a woman who would change his life in a way he never expected. Her name was Sarah, and she was much younger than him, but there was an undeniable connection between them. She was a widow, having lost her husband to cancer a few years prior, and like Jackson, she had lived through heartache and hardship. They began to spend more time together, sharing their stories, their losses, and their dreams. Jackson never imagined that, at his age, he would find someone to care for again. But Sarah brought something back into his life that he had thought he had lost forever: hope. As they spent more time together, Jackson began to feel something he hadn't felt in years: love. It wasn't the passionate kind of love he had once shared with Leah, but a steady, quiet love built on mutual respect and understanding. Sarah didn't care about his past, his mistakes, or the complicated history he had with Leah. She cared about him, the man he had become, and that was enough. And then, as fate would have it, the most unexpected turn of events occurred. One day, Jackson and Sarah found out they were expecting a child. Jackson was stunned, overwhelmed, and yet filled with an unexpected joy. At 80 years old, he was going to be a father again. It was a strange twist of fate, one he never imagined possible. But in the end, it felt right. Jackson wasn't the young man he once was, but he had learned so much over the years. He had learned the importance of family, of love, of moving forward in the face of hardship. His relationship with Noah had already proven to him that age didn't matter when it came to love. Now he was about to experience it all over again, in a new chapter of his life.